Good evening, everyone. Thank you very much for being here, for being able to attend to this event. I hope it's going to be a fantastic evening.
Okay, well, thank you guys for coming. It's an honor to be asked to be part of this event. I think it's an important event. It's an important book, a critique of the discourse of rights, the concept of rights even, and a well-deserved polemic against what she calls the liberal imagination, the hegemony of the liberal imagination, somehow contaminating the social movements. We use the language of contamination. Anyhow, I think that there's a lot to talk about, and we have a great group of people here to try to do some justice to this book. And what we'll do is we'll try to keep the initial comments relatively short so that we can open it up to a conversation, because I think that there's a lot of people here that have important contributions to make. So we'll begin first by lamenting the fact that Joseph Hoover could not be with us tonight. Queen Mary University rights scholar, international relations and politics, was supposed to be here but couldn't make it. But so we'll have to fill in for him. I'll try to say some things in his place, although coming from my own place, obviously. Also, we have the great benefit of being able to listen to Nick Hildyard, who's very important environmental thinker about the environmental catastrophe that's looming at the Corner House. He's been involved also in campaigns on the Kurdish question, raising the Kurdish question, and also has been at the forefront of taking cases against the arms manufacturers in British aerospace here. So we'll listen to some of the things that he has to say to reflect on this book. And then we also have Rona Friedman with us, who is a criminal defense lawyer, co-founder of the Justice Alliance, which is a broad-based campaign pushing for the access to justice and legal aid more generally. So we have people who both have theoretical as well as practical experience with this hegemony of the liberal imagination and the problems with rights discourse. So without further ado, I'll hand it over to Nick and to Rona, and then I'll round it off and open it up to the public for conversation. Yeah, as you guys wish, democratic and federally.
Well, I'll start with some short remarks. And first of all, say to Radha, it's been a fascinating journey through this book, and it made me reflect about my own practice as a lawyer, situated within the legal structures, which in certainly my day-to-day practice, I don't intellectually interrogate very much, although I might emotionally interrogate them at the end of the day. And the practice of a lawyer coming from a kind of left perspective today in the United Kingdom is entirely bound by and infused with and maybe implicated by an adherence to the structure of human rights, both those which are enacted domestically in law, primarily through the European Convention on Human Rights, and other more persuasive rights conventions, the ICCPR, for example. And of course, I am aware that there is a normative operation going on. And when we talk about, for example, Article 8, which is used not so much in criminal law, but in family law, and also in extradition law, which is a kind of a sub-branch of criminal law, we're really talking about the way that the normative conception of how the family should operate. And we're asking the court to adjudicate on that normative value that we're attaching to an organisation of human relations. And it's also very similar in terms of Article 6, which is the right to a fair trial. The way that it's used strategically, in the way that Radha describes new social movements using rights discourse strategically, never gets anywhere near interrogating the power structures that that the criminal justice system replicates every day, every minute, and you never get to challenge the coercive powers of the state to stop, to search, to detain, to prosecute, to imprison. You try and ameliorate the worst, the worst real life experiences of people going through that process. But there isn't, in the rights-based approach that certainly that I use on a daily basis, that stepping back and trying to challenge and in a really kind of interesting and creative way the structures that I'm working within, and that's why this book is a very timely reminder that nothing is normative. I mean, well, things are normative, but they're there for a reason. They do ideological work, and I think this book is a very, very fine interrogation of the ideological work that rights discourse does. And when I look at the people and groups within the criminal justice system who are least tolerated, very often they're the people who create an absolute challenge to rights paradigms as well, and that's very interesting. So those are my introductory remarks.
I'd also like to thank Radha for inviting me to comment on the book, and an even bigger thanks for actually having written the book, because it's a timely book, it's a very thought-provoking book, and it's a book that's sure to raise hackles in many circles, and that's a very good thing. There will undoubtedly be those who dismiss it as a rant against rights, and the title actually in some ways invites you to do that. You can hear them even now. It's sort of, so how can you criticize human rights? What about the right not to be tortured? Are you against that too? But that, I think, is to deliberately miss the point. Because, as Radha is at pains to point out in the book, this isn't actually a book about rights per se. It's about the effectiveness or ineffectiveness of organising around the current rights agenda as a means of challenging injustice in a world where transnational monopoly finance is increasingly the dominant social order. It's about how the current discourse on rights plays out in the real world, who it empowers, who it disempowers, the traps that it springs, and the dilemmas that this poses for progressive social movements. As I read it, this is a book that asks us as activists to take very, very seriously the political and economic context in which we operate, and not to airily dismiss it because right, in the abstract, is deemed to be on our side. It's a book that asks us as activists to be much more critical of our tactics and our strategies, to be much more reflective than we often are when choosing how, when, and where we shape our interventions. And as such, this is a book that, for me, raises issues that are absolutely fundamental to our organising as activists. The issue for me is not whether we talk about rights. For me, this is unavoidable. But whether or not we rely on the institutionalisation of rights to address issues of social injustice. I personally know of no social movement, historically or today, whose demands do not reflect some notion that a right has been denied or undermined or trampled on. And I can think of few contemporary social movements that would not give serious consideration to using rights-based legislation to hold the powerful to account and to obtain redress for injustice. But the landscape in which any social movement operates is never a blank canvas. It's not a risk-free space. It's occupied by social movements of all colours. The demand for a particular right to be respected is always a demand that will be used by multiple actors in varied ways to promote their own, often opposing, interests. And that's hardly surprising, because rights are not the prerogative of the progressive. Oppressors, as much as the oppressed, want rights, rely on rights, and on the institutional means to enforce them. Witness the elaborate negotiations in multiple institutions to construct new property rights that would give corporations the right to trade carbon, for example, or how technology companies are mobilizing the law to give them new private rights over our personal information. Rights are intrinsic to everybody, every social movement, every political interest. In that sense, rights never have a single predetermined trajectory embodied in the right per se. The trajectory will always be the outcome of the interplay between a constellation of political and economic forces. Rather eloquently describes how corporations and neoliberals have made use of rights discourse, particularly the use of property rights, to entrench and extend the dominance of capitalist relations. But one can use and point to other examples. One that's close to home in that I've been experienced it is the right of self-determination, and critically the right for peoples to define and redefine their culture themselves rather than to be defined hegemonically by others. This is a right or set of rights that has undoubtedly opened space for numerous liberation movements. But in the hands of the fascist new right, the same rights have been mobilized quite deliberately to articulate a vicious politics of differential racism, where racism is reframed in cultural terms. By portraying cultural identities as more or less irreconcilable, neo-fascists have twisted the defense of the right to be different, the right to self-identification, the right to self-determination, so as to serve the cause of a new and subtle form of apartheid. We're not against migrants because of the colour of their skin, the new racism shouts. We're simply defending our right to our culture. It is you, the defenders of free movement and mixing, who are the real racists. Because racism, and I quote here from a neo-fascist group that's been very, very influential, Gress, is the denial of difference. We see how such politics have been picked up by Trump, by Alternative for Deutschland, by the National Front in France, Nigel Farage, and in debates about migration in the UK. And in these circumstances, it would be utterly foolhardy for progressive social movements to assume that anyone who espouses the right to be different is necessarily on the same political page. And it would be foolhardy not to insist, as Rosa Luxemburg urged us to insist, on subjecting our own abstract articulation of cultural rights or human rights or any other rights to a thoroughgoing analysis of how that articulation is likely to play out in the real world. Such critical reflection is surely axiomatic if we are to build effective alliances for challenging and unsettling oppression. And I'll just one more point. And I think, for me, a starting point for such reflection might be to recognize that struggles over rights are always part of wider political struggle, and that a right that can open space in one context can dramatically close it in another. I think it would be useful to recognize that there's not one set of rights that are useful to all movements at all times, and that their utility, or not, is historically contingent. And this may help us in fostering greater understanding of the challenges that like-minded movements face. Why some rights, take for example the right to development, that some movements have fought over are now being viewed by the very same movements with a more critical eye. Why some rights that movements have opposed in the past are now viewed as helpful. And thus, where effective long-term solidarity might lie. And this is not some one-off screening process that movements need to do. It requires constant assessment. For rights are not some magic bullet that resolve all injustices. On the contrary, when abstracted from the context in which they are articulated, fought over, and enforced, and from the wider political forces that act on all movements, they can and do easily become the cause of further injustice. That's the cautionary tale that I draw from Radha's very eloquent expose. It's a message that direly needs reflecting on, in my view, and to be discussed, and discussed. That discussion is already live in many movements, particularly in the global south, but it's long overdue in those circles where it's still taken for granted that rights are the gleaming political sword that will right all wrongs. And I very much hope that what's wrong with rights will put an end to that.
All right. Thank you for a very hard acts to follow, actually. Let me say a few things. I mean, this is a book on a subject that is, in some ways, very dear to my heart. I remember...
Can you do the same thing with a microphone? Point it towards your...
I don't know. Try to bring it. I could speak loudly, too. I have a very loud voice, so just let me know if you need me to shout a little more. So I think that Radha is right on a lot of issues, particularly with respect to, just as someone who originally was very interested in democratic theory. I spent a lot of time in universities arguing with political philosophers about this abstract notion of right, and had no sense. A lot of the people who I argue with at places like the Yale Law School had no sense of, or to the extent that they had a sense, they felt a vocation for their contribution to, let's say, the global governing institutions that are in power as part of the global power structure. This rights discourse, which is so intimately linked to liberalism, at the core of liberalism, I think, is a real part of the problem. In terms of, we can think of the rights discourse as the good cop, to the bad cop being the NATO and the military invasions and things like this. So good cop, bad cop, and so taking on the good cop and recognizing the good cop as a cop, I think, is really an important contribution. And also, like Nick, I think my first kind of critical approach to this whole question of rights comes from background as growing up going to Catholic schools and being introduced to the kind of left-wing Catholic critique of rights and the kind of left-wing communitarian discourse. People talking about community good versus individual rights, and how the discourse of individual rights, how the discourse of rights was very much tied into reducing the political to the individual, reducing the political to legal, and then channeling the energies of activists into these hierarchical institutions to, basically beg judges to give them things rather than take things and struggle for things. I remember, but however, I remember Alasdair MacIntyre in his famous book After Virtue, this left communitarian, he said rights are like witches. By which he meant that there are these things that people invoke, and it's not clear that they exist, but they're invoked, and then they come and take a life of their own. I think I would back away from that articulation because, influenced by people like Silvia Federici, I learned to have respect for witches. That maybe rights are although we'll get back to this question of whether or not there's a double life to rights, which I think Nick sort of alluded to. So this is my first introduction. Also, then obviously, when I got to college and I was introduced to Marxism, like any good Catholic, I realized that Marxism was the next logical step. And I was, and this has resonance to me with respect to C.B. Macpherson's very important work from the 1960s, his critique of possessive individualism. And I think that you're coming at, from a different space, from a trajectory as a constitutional lawyer, someone involved in social movements, but coming to a very similar kind of criticism. And so C.B. Macpherson's book is a second book that comes to mind, and a third book, which I think is really, I'm not sure how familiar you are with it, but I think in the American context, it makes a case that's very similar. It's a book by Craig Roseberg, I think is his name, called The Hollow Hope, and it's really about the cult of Brown versus the Board of Education in the United States. Brown versus the Board of Education being the Supreme Court decision about segregation, and actually, it's a book that shows that actually when that decision finally started getting any kind of trenchancy, it was only because of the struggle of the civil rights movement on the ground, the grass rights struggle, which pushed pressure onto a legal system to be responsive and accommodating. And in fact, what the Hollow Hope argued, something very much along your lines, was that it was in many respects a false hope, and it then has led to an overdependence and a channeling of social movements' energies into the court system in a naive way, that expecting things from judges, expecting things from legal courts that are only going to be responded to if there is force coming from below. And so I think there's the polemic against the social movements for being, as I say, contaminated or infected with this liberal imagination, not taking hierarchy seriously enough. I think in the American case, there's certainly a good case to be made about that. And more generally, how the rights discourse is part and parcel of the UN Development Project, the NGO speak. Amartya Sen, I think, is a big culprit here with respect to...
Stieglitz as well.
Yeah. But, on the other hand, let's get back to this point about rights being like witches and maybe having multiple... There are rights and there is right. Now, what is right? And one of the things, so thinking about this issue of how we think of rights, just thinking of translation. When I spent a lot of time living in Spain, very interested in constitutional law, and the thing that caught me when I was in my 20s and I began really studying the way Spaniards approached and people in Latin America approached the question of rights is they use the concept derecho, which is at the same time it's simultaneously law and it's right. Law and right is sort of the same concept there, and I think that I think that there's different discourses of rights, and there's popular discourses of rights, which are linked to the idea that right, grammatically or as a word in English, is also linked to this idea of fighting for what is right. So there's rights and there's what is right. Bob Marley. Okay, a very famous song. Get up, stand up for your rights. Get up, stand up for your rights. Says it again. Get up, stand up for your rights. Get up, stand up, don't give up the fight. Preacher man, don't tell me heaven is under the earth. I know you don't know what life is really worth. It's not all that glitters is gold. Half the story has never been told, so now you see the light, eh? Stand up for your rights, come on. Get up, stand up for your rights. Get up, stand up for your... Don't give up the fight. Get up, stand up for your rights. Get up, stand up, don't give up the fight. He continues along these lines, but I think you can I think you can understand that there's a register there that really Bob Marley, as a prophet coming out of this Rastafari tradition in the countryside in Jamaica, we see that there's a discourse of rights that has a very, very powerful resonance that is not coming from above and in the courts, but about mustering the will to struggle, the sense that you have right on your side. And in fact, in Bob Marley's case, it was linked to a kind of liberation theology, and a right being linked to this idea of that those who get up and stand up for what is right have the divine on their side, and even an appeal to divine violence as what is right. So this is something that cannot be strategically or surgically undone. The fact that this discourse of rights there's a discourse of rights of the oppressed and the wretched at the same time. That is not only with Bob Marley and the wretched, let's say, but also just even in the liberal tradition. There are subversive elements of this rights discourse. So there is, of course, you're absolutely right, the dominant mode of the discourse of rights is one that, for example, when we come to liberation movements, we have difficulties fitting the liberation movement into the paradigm, because the paradigm of rights is very much institutionalized in accordance with the status quo passivism for anyone who's not a state actor, for example, and we see this in the discourse of terrorism. But we know, if we go back in the liberal tradition to someone as elementary and mainstream to the liberal tradition as John Locke, that core to his theory of rights was the right to rebel against tyranny, the right to rebel against injustice. And so I think this is actually something that we can see, for example, in current cases underway with respect to the PKK liberation movement, whether or not it makes sense to think of the PKK as acting upon a right to rebel in a situation of tyranny. And it can get some trenchants, even in these courts here in Europe that are most often functioning precisely in the way that you say. But there is that subversive potential. So dare I say, a right to self-defense as well, a right to self-government, a right, let's say, to global democracy. So there's a struggle, so let's put it this way, there's a struggle for the meaning of a term, and there's multiple meanings of a term. And I think that though your analysis is absolutely right on with respect to the dominant discourse, there is this subversive note and the subversive potentiality. So all use of the rights paradigm, I do agree with you that social movements, particularly NGOs, moving with social movements, trying to address the hierarchies that be, that it is a kind of contamination, but it also is a contradiction and a subversion. And can be. So these contradictions, I think, must be exploited. If we think of rights discourse as a modern religion, then we have to think about the ways in which we can appeal to an emancipatory tradition within that religious tradition, so to speak. So that we have to be alive to this criticism of rights discourse, but we also have to be trying to think of ways in which we can push forward the subversive potential within that discourse in ways that can undermine the existing status quo. So I think last point I want to make, because it's linked to this issue, we live in an era of Orwellian reversals. So we have a war on terror, which is a permanent war, which is fought in the name of permanent peace. We have neo-imperial invasions that spread tyranny and chaos across the Middle East and beyond in the name of promoting democracy. And I think similarly, which I think absolutely, there's another resonance between what you have to say about democracy promotion. So democracy is another one of these terms like rights, which is part and parcel of the global governing good cops, so to speak, but nevertheless act always in tandem with these bad cops. But I think you're absolutely right with respect to the liberal imagination being a problem that infects the social movements. But I do also think that we need to be thinking about ways in which we can push forward the revolutionary imagination. And I think that the revolutionary imagination can be ignited within a variety of traditions, and the rights tradition is one of them. So I think we have to think about, along the lines of what Nick was trying to argue, that there's a struggle for terms and there's a struggle for the meaning of terms, and this is a well-placed indictment of the really existing dominant discourse of rights. But I do think there's also that space for the subversive discourse of rights. So with that, I think that's enough to
Can
provoke.
I come back at a couple of things?
Yeah,
Is that okay?
sure.
There is still this tantalising aspect to rights discourse, which is the immanence, the transcendence. Where is it deriving from? And of course, if you take the liberal humanist tradition, you're talking about the Greeks, you're talking about Thomas Aquinas, you're talking about all these, these different staging posts which kind of go on this very nice kind of a line of development, and we're all going along to some kind of teleological end. But the immanence issue is really tricky, isn't it? Because if we're talking about the rights tradition and trying to extract something from it which is transgressive and subversive, what aspect of the rights discourse or tradition are you trying to grab hold of?
The right to rebel is the one.
Okay, but where's that coming from? Because if we've got the emancipatory narrative, which I think has been largely tarnished, because the liberal project itself has been tarnished, what are we trying to? Where is our purity? Is this a kind of fool's quest to find this seam of pure rights derived from something transcendent that isn't implicated in liberal humanism? Because we've gone through the rights project as the broker of the civilized. It's what Zizek described as, you've got the humanitarian bomber, that we saw with you've got the B-52 or whatever the modern equivalent is, chucking out aid packages, and is exactly the same weapon of destruction which is going to drop a missile on you. So the emancipatory power of the rights project, I think, is very tricky. And the classic example, the current example, is what has gone on in Haiti with those aid agencies. Haiti, of all places, this fantastically important place of slave rebellion, of people asserting the right to rebellion, in a most visceral way against the most brutal oppression you can imagine. And for Haiti to now be this kind of crucible, this kind of a playground for Western or Western paid for aid workers to be working out their own kind of colonizing project is really symptomatic of the corruption that has gone on in the institutionalization, the academization, and the industrialization of rights as it's been enacted for the last 20 or 30 years. So these are things we've all got to grapple with. And this is what I think you're talking about, and you're talking about, and your book talks about. One thing that was really striking for me was that example you gave of, and I bought the book, Another World is Possible. I've been to hear Boaventura D'Souza Santos speak and found it very compelling. And I was very engaged with the ideas of the World Social Forum. And you really skewered it, actually, with this example of what went on in Delhi with their organisation, with the film stars and the politicians and the buy-in and the corporate hospitality. Mm-hmm. And then over the road, those activists who've been working for decades without any international recognition, who haven't flown in from anywhere, having their own counter kind of symposium. And that was a really very interesting comparison to me. And I don't know if you're valorizing one against the other, but I mean, if those old social movements because they're doing the work on the ground and they're not infused with Amartya Sen and Joseph Stiglitz' idea of, of rights talk in a neo-developmental way to enact World Bank economic policies. How is the synergy going to be made? How can we kind of bring those people together who don't have access to people in Davos who can advocate on their behalf? And the other thing, I keep waving this pen around, and this pen is a pen given to me at an event by Reprieve, which is a human rights organisation set up by Clive Stafford Smith, who is a fantastically effective lawyer, activist, campaigner for people on death row around the world. And a lot of you may know his work because of Guantanamo Bay. But Reprieve, via Clive and his colleagues, is the most canny marketer. He can pull in, big bucks. And he has nice pens, and he has, events in art galleries. And it's this strategic accommodation that some of us, me included, have made. Should we now be interrogating that? And I wrote an essay which was not as erudite as Radha's book a few years ago when I was at World Bank, and it was about the idea of peak human rights. So we've had peak oil, is this now peak human rights? Through the 1990s, it was the only show in town. And then, people like Wendy Brown, lots of people started attacking it from the left academy. And I kind of came to the conclusion, which I think you were going towards as well, that it's very interesting because I was, as a lawyer, defending lots of people during the Occupy movement, climate camp, lots of activists involved in those kind of direct action groups. And the Occupy movement was infused by anarchist ideas of mutuality and communitarianism. And yet, when they needed to, they would phone up Bindman's, the firm I was working for, because they were being prosecuted under a very kind of prosaic bit of legislation. And they'd want a lawyer to help them at court. And so they were making those strategic accommodations. They happen in the real world. And these are all questions. I don't know the answers to them, and perhaps somebody here can help me with what degree of accommodations do you get to before you really start to sap the life or suck the life out of your emancipatory movement?
Thank you very much first to Rona, Nick and Jeff for participating in this conversation, and a special thanks to Angelica, who has single-handedly coordinated the whole thing, and to Ahmadullah, who has kindly volunteered at the last minute to record this thing. But I think one of the things, responding to some of the things, and I'll say a little bit about, my own struggle trying to, be a lawyer, because I practiced in Bombay High Court for, God knows, forever, feels like forever now, 20 odd years, and working with social movements and doing exactly as you say, people will protest. And then sometimes come and ask for legal advice. We want to do this. Is it okay? And I say, don't come to me for legal. Either you come to me for legal advice or you come to me for political advice. Don't mix up the two. You do what you like, and I will do what I like in court. That is that kind of thing. And I think that this is a real issue, and this is one of the reasons why I felt that it was important to step back. What was I doing? And sometimes it would feel like Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, because you wear the gown and you wear your band and you get into the court, you walk different, you talk different, everything is different, you take it off and you go to an activist meeting and life is completely, you speak differently, you dress differently. And so I think, but the way I have resolved it, since you raised this issue, is to say, yes, I may be a lawyer, I may be an academic, I may be whatever, but I'm also a citizen. And as a citizen, I still have an obligation to think about the impact of this on wider society, on, as a member of society. My profession does not subsume everything about me. So yes, there is a job to be done in the courts, and you go and argue your cases to the best of your ability, try to get people out, do whatever it is. If I was a journalist, and I've done a stint as a journalist as well, so you go and write your articles and you do as best as you can. But whatever your occupation or your profession, we live in these institutions. There is no escaping that. I mean, if you're a woman, you live in a patriarchal society. You can't just say, I don't want to live in a patriarchal society. What do? You can't step out of these institutions. And I think one of the things I try to do in the book is to differentiate between necessity and possibility. Because we live in the world we live in. I didn't create, as I say in the postscript to the book, I didn't write the Indian Constitution. I didn't, I didn't write the UN Charter. It was given to me. I was born into it. I didn't create a patriarchal society. I was born into it. And then you say, okay, these are the constraints. I have to live within this, but I also have to keep challenging it. And so whatever the occupation, whatever the profession, I think these issues are not really only for lawyers. Of course, rights is something that we do, is our core business, if you like, as lawyers. But I think for me, most importantly, I mean, there were certain, as with any work of this kind, certain moments that are kind of benchmark moments or the flag posting moments. And one of which was in 2005, there was a strike, there was a lockout in a tea plantation in India. And tea plantations, as we know, is a quintessentially colonial institution. It can't get more colonial than that, plantation economies. And in Indian plantations, the indigenous people from central India, Jharkhand, Chhattisgarh, those areas, they were taken by the British colonial administrators to these areas, and they were established as plantations. And the plantation workers live in the plantations, and therefore they don't have this magic piece of paper in India we call the ration card. Now the ration card is a card that gives people entitlement to public subsidized food through public distribution system. So the employer locked them out, and these people, because they lived in a plantation, didn't have this ration card, and there were starvation deaths. And a number of very young, lovely, lovely young people, very enthusiastic, very committed, very sincere. What did they demand? Well, they should have right to food. I said, what is this going to do? Because the issue there is the plantation system and the Plantation Act. You should be asking for repeal of the Plantation Act. It's not a question of right to food. And that wonderful East India Company, they established this institution called the Office of the District Collector. Now everyone who's an Indian knows what a district collector is. It's a real institution even now. And it was established by the East India Company. Now the district collector is both a magistrate and administrator, as well as plays multiple roles, has the power to go to the spot. If he knows that there are people, starvation deaths or famine or anything, he has the powers to go to the spot there, on the spot, investigate and take action. So I used to ask these NGOs, why don't you go to the district collector and say you have the powers, you take action and make sure they get food. Why do you want right to food? And they would say, oh, but the district collector doesn't do anything. Or the district collector doesn't do anything. How can you be sure that whoever is administering this right to food is going to do something? Because that means there's some other deeper problem and issue here. So, that was a real moment when I thought I should really deal with this in a more comprehensive way. But when we did the anti-globalization campaigns, this was completely like, and I wrote the concept paper for on linking workers' rights to WTO trade agreements. And we said we should have a South Asian, Asian position on this. And that paper was translated into several languages, discussed with labor organizations in the entire region. And the whole thing was, we have unions. There are problems with unions, we accept that. But by giving WTO the control over labor rights, and by linking it to trade, aren't you going to lose whatever control we may have over our lives and our destinies? So those were the kind of debates that really, prompted me to kind of do this thing. And what is happening in India now is quite significant, because on the one hand we have rights of indigenous people, UN DRIP, United Nations, Declaration on Rights of Indigenous People. Now, at the same time, when that right is being legislated, established constitutional guarantees to indigenous people over land is being shredded completely. Because de facto, no constitutional amendment, nothing. But the Schedule 7 of the Constitution, which is a separate schedule which gives indigenous people their right to land as a constitutional right, and this is foundation of the nation. So you open it up, land acquisitions, allow foreign investors to come and invest in it, because we have signed up to WTO treaties and whatever. So there are existing rights which are being eroded completely by these. And then we have, UN convention, we are complying with UN conventions and signing up to rights of indigenous people. Does that make sense? I mean, it didn't make sense to me. And so one of the things that the book really I try to do is to say, let's stop talking about human rights. Because it's the word human, the prefix human to rights, that is complicating issues. So if we just take away the human and talk about rights, then we can talk about property rights, we can talk about civil rights, we can talk about democratic rights, we can talk about all kinds of rights and how these play out. And as I tell my students over and over again, rights are nothing but a piece of paper. What fleshes out rights, the flesh and bones, are the institutions. So it's not enough to look at just rights as a normative concept. Look closely at the institutions who are going to give effect to that. It's definitely not in our hands. And that is what we need to realize. And it's the articulation of our demands in the language of rights that I think gets us into this vicious, into this trap of argumentation without any nexus to, how we actually change the world. And that is what really prompted me to write this book. But Nick, you ought to add something onto it, because you had some interesting comments on institutions' sides and social movements using that.
Well, actually, my experience of different social movements has been that some of them are much more alive to these issues than others, and none are less alive than most human rights NGOs. And that is a real problem. I've had endless discussions, and they are very political discussions with social movements about using the law. From a theoretical point of view, raising some of the issues that you've raised, but also from a practical point of view. I mean, you take on a court case. We've done a lot of work around judicial review because it's opened up space for us in certain circumstances and space for other movements. So a lot of our work was on the Kurds, was doing judicial review around pipeline projects that would be funded by the British government, etc., etc. Dams would be funded by the British government, the VAE, etc. But you enter into if you go into a court case, it has the risk, if you're not really open with your colleagues, of sealing you off from colleagues, because you will get documentation that you're not allowed to disclose to anyone else, and that can be hugely problematic. You've got to argue cases in ways that desperately Procrustean in terms of your politics, and that can be hugely problematic. You can win, and even as you're winning, the other side is moving to close the gap, reverse the decision. So if you don't have the very detailed discussions, not just within your group or whoever you're working, the close people you're working with, but with a wider social movements, you can do enormous damage even while you're successful in winning a case in the law. Yeah, you can. Believe me. I mean, it can cause enormous ructions. So for me, this is always a question of the most necessary part of organising, which is to build those friendships, those comradely friendships, that allow the sort of discussion where those you're working with feel able to say, hey, wait a moment. What are you doing here? Let's think this one through. Because otherwise, there tends to be a trammeling. Now, I mean, I'll be quick, but I mean, the number of times where I have seen social movements in the South, radical social movements, broken because of a reaching out internationally, particularly where the local movements have been, or national movements have been campaigning against, say, a particular project, where they reach out to people who are working on the World Bank in Washington or in London, which have a very rote way of dealing with it, and whose immediate reaction to a lot of the issues is, we've got to demand that the World Bank takes on human rights. The last thing in the world you want is the World Bank to start defining your human rights for you. That's the last thing in the world. Now, of course, it may open up space for those in Washington. It may even temporarily open up space for those around the project. But it may almost has closed down space in the longer term. And having those discussions, for me, is the issue. That is the issue. How do you adroitly position yourself so you can take advantage of space that might be opened up in Washington, but which doesn't incapacitate you in the longer term? And it's not an easy set of discussions. There is no black and white answer to it. There really isn't. It's a nitty-gritty of politics. And my last comment would be when Radha said, when you were operating as a lawyer, and you said either ask me political advice or legal advice, I would have said, please give me both. Because actually the lawyers I found most useful are the ones who say, look, you could win, you've got a legal case, and you are winning on these grounds, but you need to be thinking that actually if you do that, you may well be narrowing the political space that you've got here and there. So it's the adroit political lawyer that I find the one most helpful. But if you don't have those discussions endlessly, day after day, constantly revisiting, never settled, then frankly, a lot of what one does will, far from being helpful in the long term, can actually be very destructive. And my last thing would be just, that if you're, Amnesty, Human Rights Watch, they do great work. I mean, I'm very supportive of them. But where you are an NGO, which basically has become a franchise for a particular silo of political activism, and where you're whole rationale is just to raise money on the back of constantly banging one drum, actually it becomes quite counterproductive. In fact, very counterproductive. And I found the least political of those who work on human rights to be in those big NGOs. I mean, you know, I remember having one discussion with someone in one of the big NGOs who was going to have a meeting with a large oil company. And I said, you know, I mean, I asked them, you know, have you, what discussions did you have internally about, you know, whether it was timely to engage? Have you talked to the people on the ground who this company is affecting? What are their views? They said, well, no, what are you talking about? I mean, obviously we're going to engage with them because we want them to take on human rights. So if you have this completely apolitical approach to it, it's very, very dangerous. And that's the message that I take from Radha's book. You know, you're dealing with a powerful weapon, rights, but it can blow up in your face if you're not very careful about always being aware and interrogating the context in which you're operating.
Just to comment on what you said about, you know, lawyers, and you would rather have legal advice and political advice.
I'm sure you gave it.
It could work in judicial review cases, but not in criminal cases. So maybe Rona, how do you juggle with your activist side and legal practice side?
I will come back to that. But when you were talking earlier about the plantation structure and these young idealistic activists wanting people to have food and asking for a right for food, it reminded me of something that's going on at the moment, which is about 2 months ago, a friend of mine who is a very activist lawyer, he's just activist, you know, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, he kind of partially won a case where the High Court said, yes, a great number of people in this country are being prosecuted for failure to pay their council tax, and they are being wrongly sent to prison. And that's all very unfortunate, but it's the fault of each individual court which makes that decision. And so the judicial review achieved precisely nothing, because it didn't get rid of the policy of prosecuting people for not paying their council tax. And of course, what Radha's position very clearly is articulating is that we should be challenging the state punishing people for being poor. That's what's going on. And that's what your book is very powerful for, you know, that's the message which is very powerful for me. And so when Nick talks about the opportunities, which they are limited, they're fun if you're a lawyer and you have that kind of mind of judicial review. He's absolutely right. You have to be very, very careful, because what my friend Sam achieved was actually a lot of angst for himself, because he's absolutely furious now, and he doesn't want people to be punished for being poor, and he wants to attack the fact that this country quite happily prosecutes people and sends them to prison for being poor. And he's realised, because he's a judicial review specialist, that judicial review isn't the mechanism for doing that. And he's going to have to rethink that approach. So that's not a criminal example, but it's a very apt example, I think. And in criminal law, my God, where do you start? I mean, I read Foucault, discipline and punishment. The criminal justice system is entirely coercive and based on performance, and the performance is of the if you've found a Foucault, it's the new attenuated version of putting the person. They are literally in the dock, not the stocks as we used to have them, and they have the most passive role in the court process, this is the defendant I'm talking about, where they are the centre of everything and they are the complete kind of negation, they're the absence of any kind of agency, actually, unless they start, in judicial terms, misbehaving. And then they have some power. If they don't want to come into court, or had a client who did a dirty protest, that's the only way, because we live in this kind of priest-like paradigm where the law is kind of, you know, funneled and filtered by these priests, the lawyers, for the defendant. They have very little agency in that process, and the criminal justice system is something so fundamental and so institutionalised, and so much the battleground of the enactment of power in its most violent sense that the state can operate. And that's a kind of long get-out for saying, I don't know, because as a criminal lawyer, being aware of all that, you're right, there is the challenge there to those of us who think like that we have to do something to make things different, very different, because that naked enforcement of power is it's damaging, very damaging for the people at the raw end of it, but it debases the rest of us as well, actually.
Okay, I think it might be worthwhile to open up the conversation to the public here. People have some questions. Contributions, remarks, denunciations.
Can I?
Yeah.
Hi, my background's in rights, housing, mostly squatting, and LGBT rights, but I'll just focus on those. And just a quick mention of the European Convention on Human Rights. Most of that was plucked from English common law, and the right, including the protocols on the rights to private property. So that's quite crucial. So what are those common law rights that underpin it? Well, take squatting. Massive peasant insurrection caused in the 14th century people to have the right to occupy abandoned land or land owned by private landlords. It's called adverse possession. Centuries on, we took advantage of it because we needed housing as gay men or lesbians, and we just see it took hold of loads of private property in Brixton because of the way they asserted their rights to occupy land. So we occupied until we forced the authorities to recognise our right to housing. Now, as we went on, the European Convention on Human Rights started to be used by companies, and they started to argue about people who had occupied land. The House of Lords, which is now the Supreme Court, said they had a right to do it under adverse possession, under squatters' rights, under our private property rights. It went to Strasbourg, who held that a private company was human, and secondly, they had the right to the property. It was by a bare majority. I mean, Labour government, if it had continued in power, would have taken it to the Grand Chamber. But the law that was passed here deprived people, homeless people, all sorts of deprived people of the right to occupy land. Squatters' rights was defeated. So there we have it. Private companies using Human Rights Act to undermine the rights that we fought for, that underpin the, and it's quite extraordinary. Anyway, let's leave it there.
Okay, hello. My name is Rahila Gupta. Can you hear me? Well, thank you all for a really fascinating discussion, and I'm not really, there's so many things I want to say, so I'm trying to limit it to just a couple of things. One was following up from what Nick Hildyard said about being a double-edged sword. As a member of Southall Black Sisters, what we found is that religious fundamentalists really use the human rights discourse in order to forward their agenda at the expense of women. So it is like everything that we get from the state, that it ends up being double-edged. But over the years, we have found that we have used the courts more and more. Although we've realized the importance of activism, the importance of filling, for example, strategically, if there is a case in court, we always fill the court with with loads of people in there. We have a demonstration outside. We try and get a national conversation going. But sometimes, whatever level of mobilization you do, you don't have that degree of public excitement, discourse, and so on. And so it's kind of affected some of the women's cases that we've taken to court in relation particularly to homicide legislation. So women who face domestic violence and who've killed their husbands. And we were extremely successful at the time of Kiranjit Ahluwalia, who was eventually released from prison because she was seen, the whole law on provocation was extended as a result of the arguments we put forward. The same thing didn't happen further down the line when we had another case, a woman called Zora Shah. Now, it could be that the way in which the law allows you to construct, fragrant femininity in terms of the woman who was virtuous and faced violence and therefore could be seen positively by the courts, as opposed to somebody like Zora Shah, who could be constructed perhaps as promiscuous or a prostitute, or So, but at the same time, when Zora Shah case happened, the political climate, the sort of feminist movement, and its level of activism was much lower than at the time of Kiranjit. So it became really hard to assess whether it was the level of activism that was not at a high enough level to influence the courts, or whether the way in which legal concepts are framed and the way in which women are framed, the way in which the messy lives of women have to be fitted into a little box which says she was virtuous, she was beaten, she was right to have killed him, or not right to have killed him, but could get out on the, manslaughter or whatever. So it's just an observation on that, really. Thanks.
Your name, please.
My name is Lek Pal. We're speaking from the Indian Workers Association. We are an affiliated organization to the Anti-Caste Discrimination Alliance. And I have been very interested to listen to your speakers here and on the opening of this release of this book. One question that comes to my mind is that we have been talking about the wrongs with the rights, and what we have been talking about the rights generally, I think, about rights of the people, but the rights that have been legislated have been legislated by the bourgeois parliamentary democracy, and the rights have been actually written in favor of the state. And here we are not mentioning the rights of the state, and whether the book actually makes a mention of that. And I'm not saying that the rights of the states are the right way to look at this thing, but the fact that the parliamentary system throughout the world actually implements rights, they actually implement the rights for their own interest rather than the rights for the people. So I think there's a bit of a confusion here, and I want a clarification from the panel on this. You know, which rights are we talking about? Because there are the rights of the people and there are the rights of the state. And I want to bring to the attention of the panel the rights of Dr. Sai Baba in India, you know, who has been incarcerated, you know, a disabled person, 90% disabled. He's been incarcerated under draconian laws, you know, which does not give him any rights at all to defend himself. Then we have the other example of Chandrasekhar Azad, who has been locked up under the state's right for national security act or something. And so there are rights and there are rights. You know, which rights are we talking about? And I think it's clear, we should be clear about, you know, that, you know, which rights we're talking about and how do we handle the two.
I mean, can I just say about the immanence and the transcendent idea of rights as a kind of body? And actually, you've articulated something which is also very problematic within that conception of rights, because you come as a right bearer, an individual litigant, if you want, as a supplicant to the state who is going to adjudicate on your rights. And they generally are either the enabler or more often the prohibitor of you enacting your, because if you come along with your liberal individualistic conception of rights, you can only go into this arrangement with the state as a supplicant, and that's very problematic. And I think that's what you're.
Yeah, and I think it's also very much linked to a point I was trying to drive home, which is linked back to your point about this transcendence versus the kind of liberal individualist perspective. One thing is to beg from a court to grant you rights. Another is to seize what is right and what is your right.
That's
yeah, and historically, this is why I went to someone like John Locke, who has been used again and again, time and again, to justify this kind of depoliticizing, states-based way of thinking about rights. It's important to remember that crucial and central to his theory was that there was a right that comes from above. And it's a right that gives you, that belongs to the people to rebel against unjust authority. And that is something that is very difficult to get out of, to cleanse. And I don't think it would be a good thing to cleanse from the social movements that just indignation. Now, where you get someone like Bob Marley, when I talk about Bob Marley, he's very directly appealing to a kind of transcendent source of rights that then checks the earthly authorities. Now, that's why I say that, not everyone has to believe in that kind of transcendent source, but there are other ways to think about rights belonging to the people, that the people have rights to rebel against tyranny. And so that is something that is very central to the genealogy of the discourse of rights that is absent from the contemporary discourse on rights, where we see it when we try to talk to the Human Rights Commissioner in the Council of Europe to lobby about the genocidal assault on the Kurdish people, and all he wants to talk about is whether or not the PKK has used violence.
So we need to talk about the custodians of right. Who are the custodians?
Yeah, who do the rights belong to? And I think you're absolutely right. I think that the distortion that Radha is absolutely on is that this rights discourse is linked to this idea that you go to the state or you go to these transnational governing institutions and you beg them to give you some crumbs.
As you earlier mentioned, the definition of rights in Spanish and in English, and I am Brazilian and Gustavo is Peruvian, and I believe we have civil law tradition as a background, and he may understand what I'm saying. What I'm saying is that the notion of right, the role of law and the state of law in civil law traditions, like in Brazil we have the role of law is something that belongs to is in the plane is introduced as the maximum, the guidance, this imaginative institution that's imposed via colonialism. So our role of law isn't a role of law, it's a state of law. We call it Estado de Direito.
That's right.
So it's not about a common agenda that here in the community we got to this point of having a role of law. It is the state of law that is imposed via colonization that's extremely violent. So I jump to the point that it was most called my attention at Radha's book, that is this, as Audre Lorde said, the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house. And we are dealing with the master's tools in our maximum institutionalization and bearing the links between all of us and this Estado de Direito, this role of law that doesn't affect any of us. And I got to the point that it was a problem of this liberal ethics that we are all agreeing with, and we are all stuck in this liberal imagination of the 17th, 18th century, and we are pushing it as if it will someday, somehow work for all of us. And this is the gap between imagining a liberal imagination from the first word, the former colonial power and the actual imperial war, the transnational monopoly finance and etc., to our real world where the majority of people are living, and it's very different from these ethics of rights.
Yeah, I'm very troubled by the direction of human rights, and Stephen Hopgood in his book The End Times of Human Rights, he translates it as capital letters human rights and lowercase human rights, from the bottom up or from the top down. Obviously, human rights is not homogenized, or it has been homogenized, and it's time for there to be a split. And I strongly believe that there will be a split in human rights coming forth soon. And that's because of the convergence of many different things. One of the problems is that the push for social economic rights is not possible under neoliberalism. It's just impossible. And human rights is powerless to deliver such advantages. That's one issue. The other issue is that human rights has become instrumentalized by governments everywhere. And I would say that it started off, or the zenith of this process was the Helsinki Final Act in 1975, when the United States and the Western powers insisted on human rights being included in the Helsinki Final Act. It was called Basket 4. And soon after that, they objected to Vietnam entering the killing fields in Kampuchea on the grounds of international law. So there's this conflict between humanitarian law and human rights law, which is increasing in many contexts with the idea of the responsibility to protect, which can sometimes override human rights law. One of the problems, of course, is that human rights has become what Rainer was saying has become essentially a demand for state intervention, based on victimhood and based on extreme examples or extreme cases, rather than collective demands. And this can't continue without discrediting human rights, and I think that is what is happening. I recently went to a human rights meeting where the argument was made that returning jihadis from Iraq and Syria are like the international brigade soldiers who fought in the Spanish Civil War. And I thought I was the only person to object to that argument. Nobody else said anything. I thought it was a disgraceful analogy, which should never have been made by a human rights activist, but it was made, and nobody else objected. I tried to argue that the brigadistas went to fight for a democratically elected government against fascism, etc., and nobody said anything. Now, this is the kind of thing which is discrediting human rights. And I would add, for example, that the United Nations Declaration was written by a few people. One of them was René Cassin. There's a René Cassin Society where his work is celebrated. But René Cassin was actually a member of the Conseil d'Etat in 1961, when several hundred Algerians were massacred by the police in Paris. He didn't say anything. He didn't resign. He didn't say anything. Another one is Charles Malik, who later became Foreign Minister of Lebanon, and later still joined a neo-fascist organization at the end of the Lebanese Civil War. So there are all kinds of contradictions which we need to examine and interrogate. I haven't read your book, but I look forward to learning more. So thank you.
Referred to by talking about Rosa Luxemburg in her famous polemic with Lenin on the right to self-determination, which I believe you have stuff to say about in the book. She says, part of the problem of rights, and this goes back to also Marx on the Jewish question, that the rights-bearing subject or citizen is this abstraction, and so it functions as a way of covering over the really existing constellations of material and power relations and the really existing struggles in which this phantasm is invoked. So I think that's a very important issue, and it's not a contingent or a coincidence that people who are really enmeshed in this rights discourse can't tell the difference between two very different types of political acts.
Increasingly they can't.
Yeah. Radha, I'm sure you have things to say about this.
My name is Paul Winter, and really I have three unconnected points arising. I only just had your book and dipped into it in the few minutes before our meeting and enjoyed what I found, but I couldn't find anything on Thomas Paine. I looked to see if there might be a deconstruction and demonstration of how mercantilism took over those ideas through into the 19th century. That's just one small point. Point two, right to rebel. Be careful what you ask for, because I hear the right to rebel proclaimed loud by the far right, particularly, for example, in their attack on so-called political correctness. They set themselves up as rebelling against a liberal and neocon consensus. Yep. So I think we have to be most careful about that. And the last is a legal point, really the history of human rights, the codification of human rights, as I maybe have read a few of some of the case law preceding that codification. Occasionally we got judges looking to something they called natural justice right, so-called. Now, clearly I don't think they did that often enough by any means, but still, it's a more flexible concept than a strict codified system. But nevertheless, I think we need the codified system. That's my own view. Thank you.
I'll make this quick. Radha, congratulations on the book. I haven't finished it yet. I've only started it, but it's amazing. You've managed to say a lot of things that I think a lot of us have been feeling for quite a while and haven't had the language to articulate. Just picking up on a couple of points, the point that you made incredibly eloquently, I don't think the contradictions are peaking. I think they're incipient. I think they are part of the English legal system that landed on us in a colonial context. I think the issue with Haiti is not the sex rings, it's what the NGOs did in Haiti prior to that, which is perfectly sanctioned by the international rights regime, which a lot of us feel is still very colonial. They destroyed the state. They put in place, at the behest of the World Bank, a series of NGOs in governance functions, somewhere between governance and civil society organizations. And then when the earthquake occurs, they get on the plane and they leave, right? And then the same regimes internationally point to Haiti and say, oh, look at these people, they can't govern themselves, right? So a couple of days ago, Isa Shivji, who was part of the Tanzanian liberation movement with Walter Rodney, did an interview with Tariq Ali, and he said the problem with the NGOs is that it's robbed us of our liberation. Nobody speaks of liberation anymore. They only talk about activism. The people who are working in the NGOs do not have a language or any type of imaginary of liberation anymore. And you've traveled a lot, right? I know this is a combination of a lot of your experience both as a lawyer and as an activist. It's very hard to think about liberation without thinking through Europe, right? I don't buy the transcendence issue. I think we need to move, unless it's a transcendence that starts from something like the Haitian Revolution as a universal gap. Is there anything from First Nations, from the women's movement in India, another language other than rights, that speaks to liberation, that inspires you?
At the outset of the Haitian Revolution, this is an interesting thing. C.L.R. James mentions it, but doesn't make much of it. Before the big rebellion started, there was a religious ceremony of sorts. There was a kind of, I don't know what you want to call it, some sort of syncretic religious ceremony. So there's a variety of different ways in which people and traditions in which people, whether or not you consider it to be immanent or transcendent or something like this, but it's something that certainly doesn't come from the sovereign.
Radha makes a very good point on mainstream the struggle as well.
My name is Stella. I just want to put a question in relation to the situation of the state, NGOs, think tanks, all the paraphernalia that is being used under the heading of human rights today in almost every conflict situation that you look at, if this is in the present Middle East, in the war, everywhere else. And if people are aware that in the big known so-called independent human rights think tanks like Chatham House, Royal Institute of Foreign Affairs, etc., going right into the parliament on human rights groups, all party groups, etc. The issue of human rights is intensely discussed. And intensely discussed in relation how to deal with conflicts. In fact, it is also discussed with human rights groups like Amnesty and various other things. You can even go to meetings and they will invite you, to be part of that, to be part of this, helping to resolve the conflict. So you will find at these institutions already people who I've seen to be involved in social movements, activists and others, lawyers, promising money, also supporting them to go to these very countries. We have at the moment from the UK possibly 30, 40 organizations that are on the ground and apparently help to resolve the conflict. So the question I'm posing here, the penetration in terms of how the state uses human rights in order to survive, its institutions to survive, is already very far advanced. And my problem is, how is this going to be dealt with? Because there are still people out there who want, obviously, to take advantage and see and think they can go either through the courts or whatever, and we can get it somehow or the other. And I think the control of the state of these kind of things is very far advanced. It's supported by all parties. And the question is interesting that even the Labour Party at the moment, their foreign policy is headed under human rights. So I would question all of this, sincerely, because I think it hasn't brought us nothing. And I've been involved in campaigns in the 80s and 90s of various sorts, where people, including myself, had the illusions we can, by stopping Balfour Beatty, stop the Iliso Dam. Nick. Why were we not able to do it until now?
Well, it's still not built.
Ha! Okay. So we better question the whole thing altogether. I think it's the biggest challenge all around. The biggest challenge all around for us activists. We better get out there and rethink the whole thing sincerely. It's not just a question of any old right, because now the state is manipulating us. That's where we are. And we think we are independent, and we can manipulate the state. Oh God, me. I really seriously think this is too human rights in the discussion here. We are no longer human rights, throw them out of the window. What do the Kurds do? Could I quote my Kurdish friends in Rojava? Okay? Well, what they do there, they take the constitution, the state of the Syrian government, they take the lawyers who are working with the revolution of the Kurds, they bring the communities together, have assembly meetings, say, read the constitution. This is what it says in terms of domestic violence. Okay? So, what do we do? Do you agree? They discuss this. Right? And then they say, well, this act of the constitution has gone. So, with one word, this sounds simplistic, but that is actually what happened with the social contract that's now evolved in Rojava. And I'm sure that Radha has many other examples all around the world where people are doing precisely that. And that is the only reason, that is the only area where we can help. Where some of you who are lawyers and experts have to help these people. Not help is not the right word, to work with them. To see that we can get the necessary change. I think all other discussion are window dressing. And I sincerely think so, and I have a little bit of a right. I think I've been an activist. I'm a professional in the theater for many years. And I have made it my business since a certain point in my time to work with those movements who actually are forced to challenge state. And they don't even know it. There are some people in the world, like in my case it was the Kurds and the Tamils. They didn't even know they were challenging the state at certain points. I think Radha would agree. And yet there was the instinct there. We knew in Europe, some of us, when we saw Germany erupting with a new institution in the 60s, 70s even, straight after the Second World War, that we were going in a different direction again. That we had to challenge more than just a few institutions and improve them. So I think, we have to go to the root of the problem and not cover up, with a few nice words how to be improve it. We really have to challenge this because it's gone very far. I have been at meetings in Chatham House and in these institutions and watched these people and talked to these people. So I'm not even an outsider. I'm an insider. I listen to them. I say to them, why are you not doing this? Why are you doing this? And some of them actually are very embarrassed. And they get to know these things, and they don't know how to deal with the situation themselves. Some of them resign, like Kane Ross. Some of them go mad, I don't know, whatever. Okay, but the situation is serious, it's blowing apart. And, you know, some of the people who come out with things, they have to leave the profession. I met only recently somebody from Chatham House who's resigned. Okay? So I do think this is very serious. It's a survival question for us in the West, as much as anywhere else. And I think there are movements on the ground, also here in Britain, and I hear, you know, I mean, attempts to change it, but we have to have a wider, serious discussion around it. Yeah, and I thank Radio for this fantastic book. Okay.
Contributions and comments, and I haven't read Radha's book yet, but I'm looking forward to it. But I think I got an idea from listening to her over the years what some of the content's going to be. I just wanted to ask a sort of a quick question, really, or just throw somebody else in. In talking about human rights, I always feel like I'm the sort of Pollyanna of human rights. I always want to reconstruct human rights or change them or find ways to make them better or more interesting or from the ground up. So that's kind of the position that I'm tending to come from. But one of the things I wanted to ask or to think about is that as well as the criticism on human rights from the left, human rights are very much under attack from the right at the moment as well, and there's a sort of something of a populist backlash against human rights. So it's been conservative government policy in the UK to want to repeal the Human Rights Act and possibly withdraw from the European Convention on Human Rights. And there's also the issues of leaving the EU and the Social Charter. And the motivations there, I don't think are the same sort of motivations that somebody like Radha has, and from her political perspective. So I guess my question is, how do we reconcile those things? If we take human rights and we uproot them and we think in a really radical way, how do we know that by withdrawing them or not using them, that we may end up in a darker place or a different place, or we might be depriving ourselves of the tools? Because somebody mentioned Audre Lorde's point about, you know, we can't use the master's tools to destroy the master's house. But then there's also the other feminist scholar, Maria Matsuda, who said, well, there are some times when that Audre Lorde is right, but other times when you just need to stand outside the courtroom and shout really loud and really demand your rights. So I just wanted to throw those points into the conversation. Thank you, everybody. Thank you.
Just one quick comment on the Spanish Civil War. I think it's worth bearing in mind that actually, I think from memory, more people from Britain fought on the fascist side than the Republican side. So it wasn't just Republicans returning, it was also fascists.
Could I just correct that? That is not true. It didn't have to be true, because there were so-called volunteers called the Condor Legion from Germany, and there were army detachments from Italy. There were very few volunteers who actually fought on the fascist side.
From Britain?
From anywhere. But there were very few.
Well, I remember this differently, but we can talk about that. I think can't use the master's tool to destroy the master's house. In some ways, I really wonder what other tools are ever used, actually. You know, they tend to be around. They are the ones around. But it's how you put them to use to destroy the master's house. We are trapped. You know, whether we like it or not, we are trapped. And when you were asking where the rights reside, well, they reside in relationships. They don't reside in institutions. They reside in relationships. And actually today they reside primarily in capitalist social relationships. And we all know that being trapped by that, I mean, it puts you in a place where you have to be very savvy in your organising to be able to undermine that and build something of your own. Now, my own view is that there are lessons from organising in the past, including lessons about organising about rights, where a lot of what actually made waves, gained ground, won rights for people, was in organising outside of what one might call polite society. Because polite society didn't give a damn about the working class, among other things. And that actually there is much to be said now at a time when the contract between labour and capital has broken down under enforced authority, austerity, structural adjustment, the massive sort of enforcement of neoliberalism, for refinding those ways of organising outside of polite society. And I think this is what the Kurds are doing in Rojava, in Bachur. It's what many social movements are doing in small ways to reclaim food, to reclaim, not the right to food, to reclaim land, to reclaim a load of things. And that is not where mainstream social activism is in the UK, and it's not where it is in many other places. But I think for me, that is the struggle for us all. And picking up on Estella's point, I mean, Elisu did make tactical use of human rights rhetoric and legislation. It could never win on that basis alone. And it would have been foolhardy to believe that it could. Utterly foolhardy. And I think one of the problems of a lot of activism today, particularly mainstream NGO activism, is that tactics has taken over completely from strategy. So, I remember, in the late 70s, for example, when if you were talking about alternative energy, you weren't talking about windmills as technical. It wasn't a technical issue. You were talking about a whole different society. When you were challenging dams, as I was very much involved in a load of struggles in India against dams, it was against the development model, explicitly so. But more and more, that explicit challenge has been shed. And I think regaining that explicit challenge is very, very important. And regaining the space to make it is very, very important. But for me, I think that if one's serious about moving from reformist reforms to non-reformist reforms, that will require new ways of organising outside of polite society. And it's a real challenge for all of us, actually. A real challenge. It's a challenge of finding new ways of funding ourselves, challenge of new ways of conversing with ourselves, new ways of discussing amongst ourselves, new ways of raising consciousness. And what is social justice if it isn't the consciousness of oppression and a growing awareness of the consciousness of oppression? But, and I think that's a really big challenge for us, a really big challenge. But I do draw inspiration from movements that are trying to do it on the ground, including the Kurds in Syria and southeast Turkey, including a load of other movements in Latin America and elsewhere. And in Britain. I mean, it's not as if nothing is happening in Britain, but I think rooting our politics in what is happening, rather than trying to invent some abstract alternative organising, is actually where it is. But there are always going to be hard choices about tactical use of rights, and the issue for me is never lose the strategic goal? How does one want to intervene to deflect and change the trajectory? Because it is always there's no place that is outside of capitalism today. Nowhere. We're always organising within capitalism, like it or like it not. And that creates real constraints on how we change things.
So we have 3 minutes for the rights of those not in the room. Why don't we just go give it to Radha, unless you have something very quick to say?
I've got something really quick to say, which is about something which women live within patriarchy, yes. One of the most disappointing and upsetting aspects of rights kind of interactions today at the moment amongst small groups of people is this internecine, I think, war between women who claim the right to identify as biological women and women who are claiming the right to be transsexual women. And they are both fighting patriarchy, and at the moment they are both fighting each other in very upsetting ways. So that is, I think, what Nick is trying to say, and there is a battle to be won, and there is a very nasty turf war being carried out on that battleground, which is very unfortunate. So there's an example of a rights identity, people asserting identity rights in, I think, a very, very unhelpful and unproductive way.
Very quickly, because time is running out, I'm told. I'll just make 2 points just to sum up many issues that have come up, and thank you everyone for your comments and your thoughts on this. It's been a very good discussion. Firstly, I think going back to John Locke, which the book deals with, the main point that I want to make is John Locke said you have right to rebel. Ask yourself why a slave owner who cleared indigenous land wanted right to rebel. And when you ask that simple question, it unravels a whole way of thinking about rights. The second point I make is more directed to the left discourses, that where we say somehow we should salvage something from rights. And I argue that in the 19th century, when Marx wrote about the Jewish question or whatever it was, capitalism was different. You need to make the connection with rights and capitalism, rights and institutions, and the transformations that happen in capitalism. In other words, keep up with the changes. Don't live in the 19th century. And therefore, the internationalization of rights and the institutionalization of rights makes it a completely a different kind of beast today, because that was not the 19th century. So when Marx talks about conditional uses of rights, it was another kind of capitalism. After 1945, when the World War ended, we have another different kind of capitalism. And in some ways, we need to update our understanding of rights. And that's really the crux of the whole thing. So I'll just stop with that, and thank you all again for a wonderful discussion.